This is for...
Hi, welcome to another programme in the season celebrating our first birthday. Apparently, Andrew Rawnsley's been looking at our record over the past year. Yeah, well, fair dues, you know, really. Yeah, I don't mind. I think we should all be allowed to criticise Harriet Harman. Ooh, damn.
Dawn has broken. We are now today the People's Party.
"18 years of Conservative government, the longest stretch of one-party rule since the Crimean War, had drawn bloodily to a close.
Politics is a rough old trade. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't.
The ancien Tory regime had been sent packing. John Major said goodbye to Downing Street, buried under the new Labour landslide.
People wanted a change, and it was against the background of 18 years of a Tory administration that seemed to be getting into more corruption and mire and bitterly divided. And they wanted a change, and they shouted it very loud.
It was as close to a revolution as you can get in a mature Western democracy. A people's government stormed the barricades of power, or so New Labour's immaculate choreography suggested.
Today, we are charged with the deep responsibility of government. Today, another talking. It is time now to do. Thank you.
Tony Blair was not surprised to find himself Prime Minister. He told his closest aides that he expected a majority of around 40. He was astonished to find himself swept into number 10 with the biggest majority since 1832.
When we first gathered in Church House, all the newly elected Labour MPs, all these faces from all parts of the country that you would not have expected to return a Labour MP, and the atmosphere was absolutely electric. And Tony Blair walked in, but it's not just Tony Blair, it's the Prime Minister.
The youngest Prime Minister of the century symbolised generational change, and Parliament underwent a sex change, as the unprecedented number of women MPs were instantly, if somewhat inaccurately, dubbed Blair's babes.
The arrival of all the women was astonishing, not least because of the colour of people not just wearing dark blue suits. And so the visual impact of suddenly having so many women MPs, all elected all at once, was huge.
Because there were so many of us, and because the Tories took so long to move out, we all sat on the park benches in St James's Park with sort of bodies beside us, which were the bags of mail that had come, mainly congratulations from the Northern Cement Federation, and it was like, in the hope, plaintive hope that we would remember them, I suspect, in the future.
The cameras followed me out of number 10, along to number 12, and an astute journalist said, "What job have you got in government, Nick?" And I said, "There'll be an announcement later." And I thought as I walked in, I've been in the government for about 2 minutes and I'm getting bumpers already.
For 18 years in the wilderness of opposition, Labour politicians had to make their own way into work. Not a single senior member of the incoming government had ever sunk his rear into the back of a government limousine. Not one of the senior members of the incoming cabinet had given instructions to a civil servant. Not one had seen the inside of a red box. Tony Blair was not even a member of the Commons when Labour was last in power. Some of his MPs were still at infant school. There was a quite widespread fear, not least among the new governors themselves, that they would fall flat on their faces.
I still can't entirely get used to the idea of everywhere I go people saying yes Secretary of State, no Secretary of State. I mean, I'm one of the few people, I suppose, who's not really become used to being an MP, let alone a cabinet minister.
We were almost sort of numb-struck by the size of it, and I think at the same time there was a feeling of concern. Look, this is our big chance, we've got to get it right.
Inside number 12, the men and women responsible for getting the government's business done had a heavy agenda.
Right, morning, colleagues. Morning. All right. It still is, I think. We will start with the business for the next fortnight and the whipping arrangements.
Handguns were to be banned, so were landmines. VAT on fuel was to be cut, and a windfall tax would finance a new deal for the unemployed. A breathless beginning which took the wind out of Whitehall.
They had a first day book and a first week book that said precisely what they were going to do, and of course we all remember the momentum of those first few weeks. Gordon Brown's independence of the Bank of England and the social chapter, etc. But how much they had a governing strategy is more in doubt.
It was New Labour's best kept secret, Gordon Brown's plan to hand control over interest rates to the Bank of England.
I came in with a letter I drafted to the Governor, which we'd worked on in the last period of time before the election day, and then we spent all the weekend working on all the details of what would be the legislation for what was a very fundamental change in monetary policy. And I wanted to start that way because stability and getting monetary and fiscal stability and breaking from stop-go is the biggest starting point and the biggest problem that Britain has faced in the past.
Across the road, Robin Cook arrived in his new domain to receive the congratulations of his American counterpart.
I remember one of the very first phone calls I received was from Madeleine Albright. When I hung up, I said to my private secretary, oh, maybe we should have had somebody listening to that. And he said, rather disarmingly, oh, don't worry, Secretary of State, two of us were.
This government was really almost the most inexperienced government ever. But for the first 3 months, they didn't look inexperienced. They took to the ice and skimmed over it like highly skilled skaters.
The outside looked the same. On the inside, it was all change.
In terms of the atmosphere within Downing Street, I think there has been a kind of revolution. This is a really lively atmosphere now. You know, there are people rushing around on stairwells, stopping for quick conversations. They're on their mobiles, they're taking their pager messages. They're on the internet, you know, looking for new ideas, communicating with people. It's informal, it's relaxed, but it's a kind of real hive of activity. There's a real buzz about the place, a real sense of energy and purpose.
Probably the best boy in your town.
From the beginning, it's call me Tony round the cabinet table, and the Prime Minister chose to conduct affairs not from behind a desk, but on an easy sofa. But his relaxed appearance masked ambitions to impose a rigid and centralised control of the government machine from number 10. Hardly had he become Prime Minister than he was being promoted as presidential.
Tony enjoys the glittering side of the job. He enjoys the world stage. And the presidential style he's introduced is a quite striking innovation in British politics. He can see that why blue yonder and that blue skies vision and leave hard-working chaps like Gordon Brown to go out and deliver the detail.
As power flowed to President Blair, ministers muttered that little of substance was decided at Cabinet, a complaint picked up by Labour veterans.
Cabinet meets now for 40 minutes on a Thursday morning, and I'm told that the real decisions are taken by the Prime Minister and his 2 or 3 most intimate colleagues, and perhaps the effective minister.
I'm fundamentally in favour of short meetings, and generally speaking, we discuss all that needs to be discussed. A great deal of discussion goes on in smaller groups of the Cabinet, either formal committees or informal committees.
Cabinet government has been dying for 40 years in this country. I'm not sure it's quite dead yet, but Tony is very near to giving it a lethal injection.
In Tony Blair's government, huge power is wielded by ministers who aren't even in the Cabinet, who don't even have a portfolio. At the centre of the Downing Street web is Peter Mandelson. Within hours of taking office, he issued instructions to departments to clear policy decisions through number 10.
It's important to have a strong centre of government because you have so many different departments, so many different ministers and tens of thousands of civil servants all beavering away, you know, on their own patches, in their own way, sometimes rather tunnel-visioned, but the government's interests as a whole prevail over any departmental or sectional interest within it.
Cabinet ministers called in to number 10 to report to the Prime Minister haven't found him alone. At his right hand sits Peter Mandelson, who calls himself the quality controller.
You have to decide what you're going to reach out and take off the conveyor belt and sort of look at and examine and turn inside out and see whether it's sort of baked properly. And sometimes you have a sort of thought, well, this doesn't look quite right to me, or I'm not sure whether this has been properly considered, or has this consideration been introduced to it, and you sort of take it off and sort of challenge it. And if you do that too often, you know, you really get up everyone's noses. I mean, you really do, you know, irritate people.
Outwardly, the Blair government has always stressed its modernity, but insiders say that it is best described as a medieval court. Enthroned at the apex, King Tony, a benign and inclusive ruler, never needing to speak ill of anyone. Because that can be done by his trusted councillors, principally Alistair Campbell, the keeper of the King's image, Peter Mandelson, the enforcer, and the Lord High Chancellor, Derry Irving, who believed the court metaphor so entirely that he compared himself with Cardinal Wolsey. The ministerial barons, the greatest of whom are Brown, Cook, and Prescott, have pursued ill-concealed rivalries with each other and with the King's councillors. Some feuds go back into the mists of time, and the animosity remains as sharp as ever. When John Prescott was introduced to a crab called Peter, he couldn't resist a jibe at the minister without portfolio.
I think you'll get on the executive, Peter. Me and my mate Peter.
It's my kind of humour. I think people who know me, it is about humour. And in politics we should be able to laugh at each other. And I might say Peter Mandelson also laughed about it as well. But of course there were many more people who wanted to make more from it and did so. Poor old crab.
I had John on the phone, on my mobile telephone, the moment I got into the car, saying, I think something's gone wrong. And I said, what do you mean something's gone wrong? He said, I think I said something which has been misinterpreted. I said, well, don't worry. I said, you know, thinking it's not the first time. Don't worry. He said, no, I think it's going to become a big story. I said, well, what is it? And then he gave me this really complicated story about a crab. To be perfectly honest, I didn't have a clue at the end of the conversation, really, what he was talking about. When I got back to the office, I knew well enough.
The most crucial relationship in any government is that between numbers 10 and 11. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were the founding axis of New Labour.
They need each other. They need each other, you know, more than any other Chancellor and Prime Minister have perhaps needed each other. And the background and the baggage that they bring with them in terms of their relationship is so strong and stood the test of time for so long.
But once in government, those around the Prime Minister complained that the Chancellor had created a rival court at the Treasury.
To an outside observer, Gordon seems to be incurably committed to having a tight band of trustees round him who are his people, not the government's people, not Tony Blair's people, his people.
Labour imported its spin doctors into government, where they have frequently spun against each other. The most explosive relationship, that between the Prime Minister's chief spokesman and Charlie Whelan, the Chancellor's mouthpiece.
Make no mistake, this is creating, I think, certain problems that when you talk about spin doctoring is about putting a political message to what might be a departmental one. That's created certain tensions.
And the degree of tension between Number 10 and the Treasury surprised even those with first-hand experience of this pivotal relationship.
I must say, all the pressures that have arisen between Prime Ministers and Chancellors in the past, I do not recall a spokesman for the Prime Minister ever describing the Chancellor as psychologically flawed. So I think there have been some low moments in this relationship.
We're a team working together. We're a cabinet that's got to make quite difficult decisions. At the same time, of course, you've got a press that will speculate, as you know yourself, and rumours and gossip are very much part of the political landscape.
Well, you mentioned gossip. I have to put this to you. I mean, do you think you're psychologically flawed?
No, and I don't know who said that.
Just 4 months in office, Tony Blair proved to be his own best spin doctor when confronted with the death of Diana. The self-styled People's Prime Minister posthumously crowned her the People's Princess.
The people everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess.
He spoke to the nation while the Windsors shut themselves up away in Balmoral. Tony Blair, not the royal family, articulated the people's grief.
After the emotional trauma of Diana's death and the way that that changed people's perception of Tony Blair and how much they felt they knew him, then they began to, if you like, start the next phase. The non-transition phase, the governing phase. Well, yes, we know that's, New Labour, they're the government, that Tony Blair, we know him now, what's he going to be doing? And of course then they're blown off course by events.
The Formula One affair was an event of New Labour's own making. The party had taken an undisclosed donation of £1 million from Bernie Ecclestone, the motor racing boss, and Labour fundraisers were soliciting him for more, just when the Department of Health was preparing the promised ban on tobacco sponsorship.
I said we would have to bring about the ban in such a way as to minimise the harm to various sports, and that's what we did.
When did you discover that Bernie Ecclestone had given a large sum of money to the Labour Party?
A long way into the process.
Do you think it would have been better if you'd known a bit earlier?
Well, I don't think it would have made any difference.
Were you surprised when you learnt about it?
I suppose I was surprised, yes.
Ecclestone had gone directly to the Prime Minister to lobby for special treatment. When journalists got wind of the donation, Labour initially denied that he'd given a large sum to the party.
It's always the case that you should not outright lie to journalists. If people were saying no, absolutely not, and giving categorical denials on behalf of the Labour Party, while knowing that that wasn't the case, then they were very foolish, not least because it was pretty inevitable that it was going to come out.
The people who were responsible for providing information to the media so that the public in turn could know what was going on. I think in a very real sense, your celebrated spin doctors, your media managers, and all these people. And I think we, in a sense, we let the side down.
It was certainly embarrassing, as the Prime Minister said. It was embarrassing and it was difficult.
So embarrassing that the Prime Minister had to go on television to plead for trust. Not for the last time, Tony Blair was staking everything on his personal reputation.
I don't believe I've been tarnished, no. I think the mistakes have been made, but I think, in the end, the country's got to look at me
has got, in a sense, got to decide whether the person that they believed in is the same person they've got now, and it is.
I think Tony Blair had got over-elevated opinion of a certain sort of businessman. So when he came in contact with these bustling men with bright ties and button-down shirts and strong opinions, I think he became easily infatuated.
We did note with some wry amusement that if you get involved in the business community, then actually we're very disinterested with our money compared to them. They want something for their money, and it's, I think, arouses a lot more controversy than trade union money to the Labour Party ever did.
The businessman brought into government exposed New Labour to charges of double standards. Tony Blair talked about trust. Geoffrey Robinson, the Paymaster General, kept his trust offshore. And in other ways, New Labour's rhetoric clashed with reality. The People's Lord Chancellor was a contradiction in terms. When called on to justify the public money lavished on his apartments, he exhibited his common touch.
We are talking about quality materials which are capable of lasting for 60 or 70 years. You're not talking about something down at the DIY store which may collapse after a year or two.
At least Lord Irving had done his colleagues one favour, demonstrating the perils of conspicuous consumption.
I better not defy the gods by saying that I have not been involved in controversy of this kind. And in any event, it wouldn't be a personal virtue of mine. It would just be the coincidence of the round of fabric repair and renewal.
But you spent nothing like £650,000, for instance.
I don't think that I have, except on things like education and on health.
I think that we have to be very careful to be sure that we don't give the press any excuse. I get offered, because of the stress of my job, a lot of people saying, I've got a weekend house in, would you like to go and stay in it? And I've just made the decision that I can't go with people that I've met since I've gone into government. I just think that's too dodgy, because it gives you lot too much of a chance to hype it up and say, she's staying there, must be something there, she must have done, and it's just not worth it.
After a flying start, the new rulers had stumbled, yet the government remained remarkably popular, more popular than the monarchy. In the autumn, Tony Blair's personal approval rating soared to an unheard of 93%, and his aides joked that they'd have the other 7% rounded up by Christmas. Or was there only one way to go? Down. The relentless march of newness continued. New Labour gave itself the ambition of creating a new Britain. They were clubbing at number 10. Modernise or die, that was the exhortation to everyone, whether they were trades unions or royals.
It's not an image thing, it's not a sort of spray-on thing, it's not a sort of glossy, hey look, we look differently, therefore we are different. That's not the sort of rebranding I mean. I mean, we have to really think differently, and we have to perform differently, and we have to aspire to more as a country. We have to be much more forward-looking.
Cool Britannia was to be made flesh, or at least plastic, on a derelict site in Greenwich. Tony Blair was persuaded that the symbol of his resurgent Britain should be the Millennium Dome, even though the Cabinet wanted to scrap this Tory project.
There were some great doubts about that amongst ourselves. I think we all shared some of those doubts. I was rather more enthusiastic to think that, yes, I think the people in this country would like something to celebrate.
John Prescott weighed in very heavily in support of continuing with the Millennium Dome. I remember at one famous meeting he came in and said, look, for goodness sake, what are people going to think of Britain if we took this on, found we couldn't do it, and simply threw in the towel.
Many ministers were still not convinced. Was there a cabinet majority for the dome?
Well, when you say majority, these things are voices, aren't they, and discussions about these matters. And at the end of the day, that's what we agreed.
The dome was also a minority enthusiasm among Labour MPs.
The contents are unremittingly dreadful, but the worst thing about it is that this is £500 million of public money for which there is absolutely no real accountability to Parliament. Now, that is something I have always found very serious.
Get ready for this. Now is the time to make a difference.
Tony Blair was at his most rhetorical, attempting to convert the doubters. Believe in me, believe in my dome.
With a celebration that is so bold, so beautiful, so inspiring.
You had headline after headline attacking the dome, and slowly that began to change. And it wasn't so slow. It was when Tony Blair personally came down and put his full weight behind it.
Half the contents were still a mystery. It involved repackaging Tory ideas, and it all revolves around Tony Blair, just like New Labour. But they know that they'll be judged on more than image.
New Labour was about our election card, our promise, what in fact, on jobs, on crime, on hospitals, on health. And in those, 10 months, we've done quite a lot to meet that.
The 5 pledges were originally scorned for being too modest, but ministers were soon worrying that they wouldn't meet them. The most obvious struggle was to cut hospital waiting lists.
Our commitment to reduce them initially below what we inherited and then to reduce them by a further 100,000 is an enormous commitment, what Milton might have described as things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme.
By September, waiting lists had actually risen by 150,000. Some in government pressed Frank Dobson to downplay the pledge. Instead, he shrewdly used the bad figures to squeeze more money out of the Treasury.
We'd said that we were going to win on the number of goals scored, and it was no good halfway through the game saying, please, will you judge us on the number of corners we get? We've got to win on the goals.
Tony Blair told Gordon Brown they'd have to find the money.
We've now got the extra money, and I'm now pledging certain targets will be set and that they will be met.
Next stop, New Europe. After years of Tory frigidity, Tony Blair was welcomed with German bear hugs and Gallic kisses. He voiced the desire to be a leader in Europe.
His Excellency the Prime Minister of Hungary.
Labour had delighted the rest of Europe by signing up to the social chapter as one of its first acts in office. Tony Blair then had a golden opportunity to show leadership. It was Britain's turn to be President of the European Union.
I think he's a genuine stomach European, and he has changed the atmosphere. But of course he still quite a lot of difficult, hard, as he would call it, hard choices to be made. How far you can be a good European without attaching at least as much importance to your relations with France and Germany and the other countries as to your relations with America.
To European eyes, it soon looked as though New Labour's special relationship was not across the Channel, but across the Atlantic.
I think they're doing very well. I'd like to have a 179-seat majority. I'm not going to give any advice. I'm going to sit here and take it.
Tony and Bill share a love-in. Robin and Madeline share a hotline.
She did say that because we were speaking regularly, she would find it helpful we had a secure means of communication. So we had installed this black box by somebody from the American embassy and checked out every morning by somebody from security, so we can speak on a secure line. Actually, as it happened, she didn't ring for a fortnight, and then in the middle of a meeting, suddenly, unexpectedly, the phone rang, and my private secretary dashed across the carpet, picked up the phone on the black box, and it was a wrong number.
Once they'd fixed it, Robin and Madeline were never off the phone, especially during the Gulf crisis. London didn't have a hotline to Paris or to Bonn. Britain appeared to be less the representative of Europe to America, more Washington's spokesman in Europe.
I think the feeling on the continent is we should have gone through the motions of trying to create a common position. The fact that Blair went off to talk to Clinton about it and didn't make a big thing of being the representative of the European Union at that time, as Blair was, certainly caused quite a lot of upset in France, but also in other countries.
Throughout most of Europe, there was a recognition that actually it was a great asset to Europe to have a country in the presidency which was respected and had a close relationship with the United States.
Indeed, I would have thought that Europe has actually taken the lead on this issue on anyway.
Tony Blair would not realise his ambition to lead Europe so long as Britain stood aloof from Europe's biggest leap, the single currency.
Before this time where UK will join the euro, of course, the influence of Britain in Europe will be smaller than it could be.
Labour came to office without an agreed strategy towards the European single currency. Tony Blair's more pro-European ministers urged him to capitalise on his honeymoon by calling a quick referendum to take Britain in. But the party's pollsters and focus groups were telling him that the majority of the public were still hostile to the euro. And so were the right-wing newspapers that New Labour had worked so hard to woo. The sun, Mr. Blair was warned, would go down on him. These internal arguments began to leak out as ministers gave contradictory briefings about the government's intentions.
It was important in the first few months of the government to have a clear statement of policy that was long-term and people understood to be conclusive. And until that statement was made, and of course there had to be consultations on that were far-reaching, until that statement was made, there was always bound to be speculation.
I had a number of discussions with both the Prime Minister and with the Chancellor on the single currency. The three of us discussed it together along with the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott.
They decided to rule out joining the euro this side of the election.
We'll be stuck on the fringes of this huge negotiation to create the euro. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried too about the loss of influence in shaping monetary policy in Europe. We'll have to go along with it whether we're members or not. We can't devalue against it and still have access to the single market. I think that will be very difficult. So we will be stuck with the disciplines without the influence. And I suspect that the Blair government will feel, even indeed perhaps a degree of humiliation about that position as time goes by.
But in Tony Blair's view, nothing would be as humiliating as losing a referendum. He wouldn't risk his second term for the single currency.
The abiding idea in the government, as far as winning elections is concerned, is that you can't win without the tabloids. And therefore, there's not very much likelihood of the government doing much that the tabloids will denounce, or at least will make the tabloids turn on the Labour government. That's why we took quite the wrong decision about the single currency. That's why we've cozied up to Mr. Rupert Murdoch.
Tony Blair was even prepared to talk to the Italian Prime Minister about Rupert Murdoch's ambitions to expand into Europe. The most benign interpretation of that controversial call is that it's part of a cunning plan to turn the media mogul into a good European.
I suspect at the end of the day, Rupert Murdoch would say, as a pragmatist, well, if it really is in the interests of the British economy that we're in rather than out, you know, if the whole monetary union, if the whole project has been established successfully, it's got underway, everyone's flocking to it, and we are losing out economically and financially by being apart from it, I think that as a pragmatist he would say, okay, we've got to go in.
To New Labour, an Australian media tycoon with an American passport is the most important swing voter now and at the next election.
I've never known a British government which was so obsessed by the second term. It's a characteristic failure of United States presidents, but in Britain, governments will normally get on with this parliament rather than winning the election and having a second term. Tony Blair's obsessed by the second term, and so are the people around him.
18 years in opposition concentrated our minds about getting the priorities right. And therefore we're here not only to win that election, I'll let you into a secret. Our strategy is to win too.
To do that, Tony Blair would have to hold together the coalition of new and old Labour that put him into power. But his government threatened to fall apart over welfare reform.
Evens, 2 bar.
Not Tony Blair's New Britain, John Prescott's old Labour heartland of Hull. They'd won power by securing the votes of the contented suburbs and Labour's traditional constituency. The harder trick in office was keeping both satisfied.
New Labour is a coalition that relies on its established vote and its newcomers who actually expect a change from the policies of Thatcherite, Majorite Britain. And so I believe that they are looking for something different. And they're looking for a bit more security at work, they're looking for a bit more equality, and they're thinking for a better deal for the people who are the most vulnerable.
No Labour MP thought they'd been elected to deliver a worse deal to the most vulnerable. But on the 10th of December, they found themselves voting to cut the incomes of lone parents.
I spotted the Danes at too late. It wasn't our greatest moment, and the damage it did to us politically, in a sense, was that suddenly a number of people out there, mainly, I have to say, in the Labour Party rather than in the wider world, were saying, oh my goodness, you know, they're driven just by a Thatcherite agenda of cuts.
Those that stood to lose most were lone parents in low-paid work, and with so much for work incentives. It got into a lot of problems because it was a completely unjustifiable cut. It was unjustifiable when the Conservatives first mooted it, and it was unjustifiable to continue with it.
Every mother is a working mother.
The cut was a product of the election pledge to stay within the Tories' spending limits, but £60 million could have been found to avoid this traumatic episode, and would have been found if its implications had been thought through. The Cabinet were never consulted.
I would have thought it ought to have been discussed at Cabinet, but, you know, that's not my job.
But it would be better if it had been discussed at Cabinet.
I think most of these issues, where you know you've got a problem that's bubbling up like that, it is better to discuss it within the party machinery.
Those are all the matters arising out of business. I've got one or two.
Labour backbenchers boiled over, and they communicated their anger to their whips.
We're aware that there was unease in the parliamentary Labour Party over the change in single-parent premium, and that view was certainly conveyed. It is a heavy three-line, all the way through.
Downing Street would not buckle to backbench pressure. Resolved not to be another John Major, Tony Blair would rather behave like Margaret Thatcher.
I can answer the Honourable...
Harriet Harman had to defend the cut before Parliament. The Social Security Secretary twisted in the wind.
Young children out to work.
I think there's something rather punitive and cruel about these cuts, and something rather arrogant. And of course they'll go through with the support of the Tories tonight, but they would certainly not go through with mine.
If a lone parent loses...
Harriet Harman was abandoned by the senior colleagues whose orders she was carrying out. Neither the Prime Minister nor the Chancellor could make it to her side.
I've always supported what Harriet has done on this, and I think I've made it absolutely clear, as has Tony Blair. But of course you don't attend the House of Commons for every single debate that takes place. She knows, of course, that we were entirely behind the change that she made, and of course we made it in the full knowledge we were making other changes later on to improve benefits for children, and also, of course, to improve the welfare state as a whole.
With unfortunate timing, on the night of the cut, the Prime Minister was back at number 10, pouring champagne down the throats of celebs.
Do you think, on reflection, though, it would have looked better if the two of you had turned up?
No, I don't think so. I think people would have judged they would have suggested that the policy was not Harriet's. It was being imposed upon her, and that would have been very unfair. We did this together.
One of the points I made at future occasions was that ministers needed to be more visible in some of these situations.
Some tore up their party cards in disgust.
We also had members of the public writing to us saying we were going to give this donation to the Labour Party, but we're so cross with them, we're going to give it to you instead.
Mutiny broke out among the regimented ranks of Labour MPs. 47 voted against the government. The next morning, number 10 said that rebels would be severely dealt with, but the chief whip would not be bounced.
Amongst the welter of advice that I receive in doing my job as chief whip is advice about disciplinary matters. But the Labour Party's rules are quite clear. The responsibility for disciplinary action is mine and mine alone. I have a duty to consult other people, but I have to make the decisions on it. And whilst I'm the chief whip, the job will be done my way. Whilst I'm interested in other people's opinions, the responsibility is mine.
Many of the MPs who supported the government did so with bitterness, and only after assurances from their chairman that the leadership had learnt its lesson.
I didn't need to go in and slap down a bit of paper and say, look, have these lessons been learned, tick them off, please. And I really didn't. The very fact of the sort of conversations I'd had were telling me that the lessons had been learned.
Disabled people feared they would be the next target. Tony Blair was shocked by the anger he'd aroused. Senior colleagues protested to him that it looked like a Treasury attempt to salami slice benefits. He made himself chairman of a new welfare review and went out to make the case for change. Welfare reform, which had barely featured in the election campaign, had suddenly become New Labour's big idea.
Should have the guts and the courage to see these reforms through, to make them work in the interests of our people.
I think we're all generally agreed that it caused great consternation and debates, and directly from that, I think, has come the Prime Minister's own handling of the review of the welfare state.
Even the most loyal New Labourites privately confessed that welfare reform had got off to a calamitous start. The government backed off attacking any further benefits, fearing to feed the left-wing charge that they were simply Tories wearing New Labour clothing. Tony Blair talked about the third way. The pressure was now on to put substance on the soundbite. The answer came in Gordon Brown's second budget. No old Labour government would have cut corporation tax to its lowest level ever. No old Tory government would have made such a large, if cleverly disguised, switch in resources from the rich to the poor.
I was trying to create a fairer society, and if there's a redistribution, it's in favour of work and opportunity. And of course, that helps everybody who's prepared to work and work their way up and work harder.
We all know circumstances dictate that some families will need more help than others.
The budget drew much of the sting out of the lone parent benefits trauma. The Chancellor boosted child benefit and introduced childcare credits to encourage mothers into jobs. The same philosophy guided the welfare to work schemes. In New Labour land, you work, therefore you are. It's an unforgiving place for those who won't or can't, and it all hangs on the economy working.
I think they're lucky so-and-sos. They've had a very fortunate 12 months. But if UK Limited begins to suffer a bit, if things slow down, particularly if, as I believe, unemployment starts going up again within the next 12 months, then all this about how these unemployed people across the country are going to rush out to get the jobs on offer because it now pays them enough to take the job is going to look a bit sick.
What we're doing, and I'm proud of it, is we're shifting big issues. It would be easy on welfare to work to just say, okay, we're going to give people an extra bit of money and, Labour doing its thing. No way. Benefit system doesn't work, and I want it to work for people that need it. And we're taking tough decisions, and it won't be easy. It hasn't been easy in the last couple of months, and it will get tougher.
No one denies that this government has been radical when it comes to constitutional reform, not even those who think it's radically wrong. The United Kingdom is being reconstituted, beginning with the establishment of a Scottish Parliament to be elected by proportional representation.
I don't believe that if we'd been holding this interview a year ago, either of us would have suggested that we would have got so far down the road to achieving our objectives in terms of constitutional change. London government, Welsh government, freedom of information, European Convention on Human Rights, and there's a lot happening apart from Scotland. And it's got to be seen in that wider context. We're also getting PR, for example, in the European elections. It really is, when you think about it, probably the biggest shake-up for the British Constitution that we've seen this century.
Paradoxically, while the Blair government is obsessed with control at Westminster, it's willing to disperse power away from Westminster.
There is no doubt it opens up probably the most exciting period that we've seen in Scottish politics in the century. And it's been an act of some courage, if you look at the change in the voting system, for example, not in the short-term interests of the Labour Party, but done because it was right, because as a matter of principle, we felt that it would give us a more representative parliament.
Labour's taken a risk, perhaps a larger gamble than it realised. The biggest gainers from devolution could be its political opponents. The Scottish nationalists are already breathing down their necks, and Labour will only be able to govern Scotland in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. At Westminster, Tony Blair started experimenting with collaboration by inviting Paddy Ashdown into a cabinet committee.
What he wants to do is to create bridges between those who have the same values, the same goals, the same objectives, even though they may come from different party backgrounds, in order to forge a political alliance which reflects that coalition in the country which I previously described, that will enable the radical centre and the radical centre and left of British politics to govern for generations to come.
The split on the centre-left in British politics, the split between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, has, on the whole, made the 20th century a predominantly Tory century, in a way that the 19th century never was. And it wouldn't be a bad ambition to try and make the 21st century not a Tory century either. And I think that is one of his most deep-seated general objectives, and one I wholly share.
One way to permanently redefine British politics is to change the voting system. And it was the grand old man of consensus politics that Tony Blair chose to chair a new commission on electoral reform.
I wouldn't think it worthwhile doing this job if I didn't think he was doing the job of President of the Chairman of the Electoral Reform Commission, unless I thought he had a reasonably open mind about it.
But even his most senior colleagues don't know what Tony Blair is up to. The cabinet is split. The Prime Minister's deputy is against a change in the voting system.
What he's asked Roy Jenkins to do is to look at that in the context of our overall political system, and the fact that he's chosen Roy Jenkins is a judgment for him.
So, will the Prime Minister eventually come down in favour of a change in the voting system?
Well, the Prime Minister said he's against proportional representation.
It is an issue which he approaches with a commendably mind that is inquiring, but at the same time recognising the cases for change and the problems of the present structure.
Northern Ireland is the greatest test of Tony Blair's belief that there is a third way. He sent the indomitable Mowlam to Belfast as an ebullient bulldozer through the old posturing, and he again broke with the past by inviting Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams into number 10.
Tony does an excellent job at seeing all the parties. One of them said to us, we've seen this Prime Minister more than any other, and more than adding all the other Prime Minister visits we've done together.
That effort paid off when the talks reached their crunch point. Tony Blair dashed to Belfast to put his special brand of trust me politics on the line.
A day like today, I mean, it's not a day for sort of sound bites, really. We can leave those at home, but I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this.
The settlement at Stormont showed the sceptics that Tony Blair was not merely magic with a soundbite. This was an achievement of real substance. If it brings lasting peace to Northern Ireland, it will deserve the appellation historic. The pace has been frenetic since last May.
I think the one thing I'm missing in government is actually fresh air, because you never get outside an office or you never get outside a building, and just to walk in the fresh air is actually a huge benefit that I don't think you know you're going to lose.
I suppose I'm getting a bit spoilt by the comfort of it. I mean, my husband said to me, we were out shopping a couple of weeks ago, and I was waiting for the lift button to be pushed in the shop. And he said, "Why you pressed the button?" And I said, "Oh, sorry, I forgot." But I hadn't pressed a lift button for 8 months.
Tony Blair is often mocked for being interested only in instant popularity. Yet his long-term ambitions are extraordinary. A restructured welfare state, a reshaped constitution, a new Labour millennium. He says all this will be his legacy by the time these children are old enough to vote. You can't say Tony Blair doesn't believe in anything. He believes in Tony Blair.
"30 years ago, one of our most controversial politicians made an announcement